The people who smile through pain are often hiding the heaviest burdens. The crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across the ballroom of the Grand Crescent Hotel, turning every glass and polished surface into something that looked almost magical. Wealthy investors laughed over expensive dinners. Soft piano music floated through the air. Waiters and waitresses moved quietly between tables, carrying trays filled with sparkling water and carefully prepared meals. To most people in the room, it looked like a perfect evening. Emily Carter knew better. She balanced a silver tray against her shoulder and forced herself to keep moving despite the ache that traveled through her right leg with every step. 3 months had passed since the accident. 3 months since a distracted driver had sent her spinning across a rain-soaked intersection. The doctors had told her recovery would take time. Time was something she couldn't afford. Medical bills didn't wait. Rent didn't wait. Life didn't wait. So she smiled. She worked. And she pretended everything was fine. Table 12 needs another bottle, called Rachel Monroe from across the room. Emily nodded immediately. Yes, ma'am. Rachel didn't answer. She rarely did. Emily crossed the ballroom, her black uniform perfectly pressed despite the long shift. Guests thanked her. Some complimented her service. One elderly couple even slipped her a folded $20 bill and told her she was the kindest waitress they'd met all year. Emily thanked them with a gentle smile. Moments like that helped. They reminded her that kindness still existed. At the center of the ballroom sat Jonathan Hayes, billionaire, CEO, one of the most powerful businessmen in America. His table overlooked the entire event. Investors surrounded him, eager for his attention. Yet Jonathan seemed oddly detached, his gray eyes drifting around the room more often than toward the people speaking beside him. Years of leading a global company had taught him something valuable. Numbers told part of the story. People told the rest. His gaze settled briefly on Emily. She moved with remarkable grace despite a subtle limp that most people would never notice. She smiled for every guest. She thanked every customer. Yet something about her eyes suggested exhaustion that reached far deeper than physical fatigue. Before Jonathan could think further about it, a loud voice interrupted the music. Emily. Rachel's sharp tone sliced through the ballroom. Several guests turned their heads. Emily immediately hurried over. Yes, ma'am. Rachel pointed toward a table near the stage. Those glasses should have been cleared 10 minutes ago. I'm sorry. I was helping another customer. Rachel's expression hardened. Excuses again. Emily lowered her eyes. It won't happen again. The conversation should have ended there. Instead, something changed. Rachel stepped closer. Too close. Emily instinctively tensed. The fear that flashed across her face lasted less than a second. Most people missed it. Jonathan Hayes did not. The ballroom suddenly felt quieter. Emily took a small step backward. Her fingers tightened around the tray. Please, she said softly, her voice trembling in a way that seemed completely unlike her calm demeanor. Please don't kick me. I'm already hurt. Silence. Absolute silence. The piano stopped. Conversations vanished. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Rachel's face turned pale. Emily looked horrified by her own words, as if they had escaped before she could stop them. And across the ballroom, Jonathan Hayes slowly rose from his chair. What caught his attention wasn't the sentence itself. It was the terror behind it. The unmistakable fear of someone who wasn't reacting to one bad moment. The fear of someone who had been carrying a secret for a very long time. No one moved. For several long seconds, the ballroom remained trapped in silence, as though the entire evening had forgotten how to breathe. Emily Carter stared at the floor, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She had not meant to say those words out loud. She had spent months teaching herself to stay quiet, to smile, to endure whatever came her way without drawing attention. Now hundreds of eyes were on her. Rachel Monroe forced a nervous laugh. I think there has been a misunderstanding, she said quickly. Emily has been under a lot of stress lately. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Others looked away. People often preferred easy explanations over uncomfortable truths. Emily nodded immediately. I am sorry, she whispered. I should get back to work. Jonathan Hayes watched carefully as she bent to pick up the tray. Her hands were trembling. Not dramatically. Not enough for most people to notice. But enough. He had spent decades negotiating billion-dollar deals. He knew fear when he saw it. More importantly, he knew the difference between temporary embarrassment and something much deeper. Emily returned to work as though nothing had happened. She refilled glasses, collected plates, thanked guests with the same gentle smile she had worn all evening. Yet Jonathan noticed something else. Every few minutes, her hand drifted toward her right leg. Not enough to attract attention, just enough to suggest pain she was trying desperately to hide. The gala finally ended shortly after 10 o'clock. Wealthy guests filtered toward the exits beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Valets hurried through the cool spring night, retrieving luxury cars. Staff members began clearing tables. Jonathan remained seated long after everyone else had left. Across the ballroom, he watched Emily gather linens into a cart. Most employees looked exhausted after the event. Emily looked exhausted before it had even begun. At 11:30, she finally clocked out. Jonathan saw her leave through the employee entrance carrying a worn canvas bag. He expected her to head toward an apartment building nearby or perhaps a bus stop. Instead, she walked 3 blocks through the chilly night and crossed a nearly empty parking lot behind a grocery store. There, beneath a flickering streetlight, sat an aging silver sedan. Emily unlocked the driver's door and climbed inside. Jonathan frowned. 10 minutes passed. The car never moved. The engine never started. The realization hit him slowly. She was not preparing to drive home. She was already home. Inside the sedan, Emily exhaled and leaned back against the seat. The tiny battery-powered lantern hanging from the rearview mirror filled the car with a warm glow. A folded blanket rested behind her. Several neatly organized plastic containers sat on the passenger seat. A small cooler occupied the floorboard. She moved through the familiar routine with quiet efficiency. Shoes off, blanket unfolded, phone plugged into a portable charger. Another night. Another temporary solution. Her gaze drifted toward a photograph tucked inside the sun visor. A smiling teenage boy stared back at her. Matthew, her younger brother. The reason she kept going. The reason she accepted double shifts and endless exhaustion. The reason she ignored her own pain. Emily smiled softly at the picture. Just a little longer, she whispered. Outside, unnoticed by her, Jonathan Hayes stood across the street beside his black sedan. The billionaire CEO had seen countless penthouses, private islands, and luxury estates. Yet somehow the sight of that small car beneath a lonely streetlight stayed with him longer than any of them. Something about Emily Carter did not fit the story everyone else seemed willing to believe. And for the first time that evening, Jonathan found himself wanting answers. The next morning arrived wrapped in gray clouds and a light drizzle that painted the city in shades of silver. Emily Carter woke before sunrise inside her sedan, just as she had for the past 7 weeks. The cramped space left her neck stiff and her injured leg aching, but she ignored it. Pain had become part of her routine. She folded her blanket, stored it neatly behind the seat, and checked her phone. 6:23 in the morning. Her expression softened when she saw a new message. It was from St. Matthew Medical Center. Visiting hours unchanged. Matthew had another therapy session scheduled that afternoon. Emily stared at the screen for a moment before smiling. Every extra shift, every sleepless night, every sacrifice had one purpose. Her younger brother deserved a future. She started the car and drove across town toward a 24-hour gym. After a quick shower and a simple breakfast from a vending machine, she headed toward the Grand Crescent Hotel. By 8 o'clock, she was already helping prepare conference rooms for another busy day. Most employees arrived tired. Emily arrived, determined. Across the city, Jonathan Hayes sat inside the top-floor office of Hayes Global Industries. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked miles of skyscrapers and traffic below. Normally, his mornings began with quarterly reports and investor calls. Today was different. His thoughts kept returning to a silver sedan parked beneath a flickering streetlight. He opened a file on his tablet. Emily Carter, age 27. Employment history, restaurants, hotels, catering services. No criminal record. No disciplinary actions. No obvious explanation for why a woman with an outstanding reputation appeared to be living in her car. Jonathan closed the file. The information answered nothing. If anything, it deepened the mystery. Around noon, he canceled a lunch meeting and drove to the Grand Crescent himself. The hotel manager nearly tripped over his own feet trying to greet him. Jonathan ignored the attention and walked through the lobby. Guests moved around him carrying luggage and coffee cups. Bellhops crossed polished marble floors. Everything looked normal. Yet within minutes, he noticed something interesting. Emily seemed to be everywhere, helping an elderly guest locate a lost prescription, assisting a nervous new employee who could not operate the reservation software, carrying supplies for housekeeping when she noticed they were short-staffed. Nobody asked her to do those things. She simply did them. More surprising was the way people responded to her. The doorman smiled when she passed. Housekeepers thanked her by name. Even guests who had never met her seemed instantly comfortable around her. Jonathan stood near the concierge desk observing quietly. Rachel Monroe appeared moments later. The contrast was immediate. Conversations ended. Smiles faded. Employees became tense. Rachel spoke politely, but something about her presence caused people to straighten their posture and lower their eyes. Then Jonathan noticed Emily. She did not become angry when Rachel approached. She became cautious, like someone walking across thin ice. The difference mattered. Late that afternoon, Emily finished her shift and left the hotel carrying the same canvas bag. Jonathan remained in his car several buildings away. He told himself he was simply curious. Nothing more. Emily drove across town, passing neighborhoods that grew older and quieter with every mile. Finally, she pulled into the parking lot of St. Matthew Medical Center. Jonathan watched from a distance as she hurried inside despite her limp. Through the glass entrance, he caught a brief glimpse of her face. For the first time since he had seen her, the exhaustion disappeared. In its place was something stronger. Hope. And Jonathan Hayes suddenly realized that whatever secret Emily Carter was carrying, it was waiting somewhere inside that hospital. Rain tapped softly against the hospital windows as evening settled over St. Matthew Medical Center. The steady rhythm echoed through quiet hallways filled with nurses, visitors, and the faint scent of antiseptic. Emily Carter moved quickly toward the rehabilitation wing, her tiredness fading with every step. Room 412 waited at the end of the corridor. The moment she opened the door, a young man sitting beside the window looked up and smiled. "You are late," Matthew Carter said. His voice was teasing, but his eyes carried warmth. Emily laughed softly. "I had to work. Again. Matthew shook his head. "One day I am going to get out of here and make you stop working 3 jobs. 2 jobs, Emily corrected. And you are getting out of here." The confidence in her voice sounded effortless. Only Emily knew how hard she fought to maintain it. She crossed the room and handed him a small paper bag. Matthew opened it immediately. His face brightened. "Blueberry muffins. Your favorite. You spent money again." It was $3. $3 you should have spent on yourself. Emily smiled and sat beside him. The conversation felt familiar. Safe. For a little while, the outside world disappeared. No hotel. No pain. No Rachel Monroe. No endless bills waiting in her mailbox. Just family. Outside the room, Jonathan Hayes stood motionless near the nurse's station. He had not intended to come inside. Curiosity had simply carried him farther than expected. Now he found himself watching a side of Emily that nobody at the hotel ever saw. The guarded waitress disappeared whenever she looked at her brother. What remained was pure devotion. A nurse approached the room, carrying a clipboard. Emily immediately stood. Jonathan stepped farther back as the nurse began discussing treatment schedules. He was not trying to eavesdrop, yet several words reached him clearly. Insurance review. Therapy extension. Outstanding balance. Payment deadline. He watched Emily nod politely through the entire conversation. She asked practical questions, took careful notes, thanked the nurse, never once complained. But the moment the nurse left, her shoulders lowered slightly. Just for a second. Long enough to reveal the weight she was carrying. Jonathan knew that look. He had seen it on employees trying to protect families during economic downturns, on parents facing impossible medical decisions, on people running out of options. 20 minutes later, Emily kissed her brother's forehead and prepared to leave. Matthew noticed the slight limp as she stood. "Your leg is bothering you again." "It is fine, Emily." She smiled. "I am okay." Matthew did not look convinced. "You always say that." The smile remained. "Because it is true." But after she walked into the hallway, the smile faded. Jonathan watched her stop beside a vending machine. She leaned briefly against the wall and closed her eyes. Exhaustion washed across her face. Then something slipped from her canvas bag and landed on the floor. Emily continued walking without noticing. After she disappeared around the corner, Jonathan approached. The item was a folded document. He bent down and picked it up. It was not a letter. It was a medical billing statement. The total balance displayed at the bottom of the page made even Jonathan pause. Nearly $87,000. His eyes moved lower. The patient name was Matthew Carter. Then another detail caught his attention. Printed beneath the account history was a note referencing a denied insurance claim connected to an accident investigation still under review. Jonathan stared at the page for several seconds. The mystery surrounding Emily Carter had just become much larger. Because for the first time, he could see the outline of something hidden beneath the surface. And somewhere inside that unfinished story, someone had made life much harder for a woman who was already carrying more than enough pain. Jonathan Hayes sat alone in his office long after sunset. The city glowed beyond the glass walls, thousands of lights stretching across the horizon like scattered stars. Normally, he would have been reviewing acquisitions or preparing for investor meetings. Instead, a single document rested on his desk. Matthew Carter. Outstanding balance. $86,942. Jonathan had spent years making decisions based on facts. The facts surrounding Emily Carter made less sense every day. He pressed a button on his desk phone. Rebecca. His assistant answered immediately. Yes, Mr. Hayes. I need information on an insurance claim involving Matthew Carter. Medical accident case. Start with the denial history. A brief pause followed. Tonight. I will have everything I can find. Jonathan ended the call and leaned back in his chair. Something about the situation bothered him. Insurance companies denied claims every day. Hospitals issued bills every day. Yet none of that explained the fear he had seen in Emily's eyes. The next afternoon, Rebecca entered his office carrying a thin folder. I found the claim, she said, and it is unusual. Jonathan opened the file immediately. Several pages detailed an accident from 11 months earlier. Matthew Carter had been injured when a commercial delivery vehicle lost control during a severe storm. Medical treatment had been extensive. Rehabilitation was ongoing. But one detail stood out. The insurance company had denied full coverage because of a disputed internal investigation. Jonathan continued reading. His expression slowly hardened. Who handled the review? Rebecca pointed toward a signature near the bottom of the page. The final recommendation came from a regional claims consultant. Jonathan looked at the name. Rachel Monroe. For several seconds, he simply stared. The same Rachel Monroe who now managed operations at the Grand Crescent Hotel. The same Rachel Monroe who seemed determined to make Emily's life miserable. Coincidence was possible, but Jonathan had built a billion-dollar company by recognizing patterns. This did not feel like coincidence. Later that evening, Emily arrived for another shift. Rain clouds hung low above the city, covering the skyline in soft gray shadows. She parked her sedan behind the grocery store and carefully adjusted the brace beneath her pant leg. The injury still bothered her during long shifts. She could not afford to care. Inside the hotel, the lobby buzzed with activity. Guests checked in. Luggage carts rolled across marble floors. Phones rang behind the front desk. Emily moved through the chaos with her usual quiet efficiency. Yet today felt different. Several employees seemed nervous. Conversations stopped whenever Rachel Monroe appeared. Emily kept her head down and focused on work. That was always safer. During her lunch break, she sat alone in a small storage room behind the banquet hall. A sandwich rested untouched beside her. Instead, she studied a folder filled with paperwork from the hospital. Payment schedules, appeal forms, rehabilitation reports. Every page represented another obstacle standing between Matthew and recovery. Emily rubbed her eyes and sighed. One step at a time, she whispered. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She quickly closed the folder. One of the housekeeping employees peeked inside. Emily. Yes. The front desk needs help. Emily immediately stood. I am coming. The folder slipped from her lap, and several papers scattered across the floor. Most were ordinary medical forms. One was different. A copy of the original insurance denial letter. Emily froze the moment she saw it. The signature at the bottom seemed to stare back at her. Rachel Monroe. Slowly, Emily picked up the page. Her hands trembled. Not from fear this time. From something much older. Something buried beneath months of silence. Because Rachel Monroe was not simply the manager who made her life difficult. Rachel Monroe was the reason Matthew's treatment had nearly stopped. And for the first time, the true connection between them began to emerge. For nearly a year, Emily Carter had carried the truth alone. Not because she wanted to, because every time she tried to fight, another door seemed to close. The hotel lobby shimmered beneath warm evening lights as guests drifted in from the rain. Outside, traffic crawled through wet streets. Inside, everything appeared polished and perfect. Emily knew appearances could lie. She slipped the insurance letter back into her folder and returned to work. Her face remained calm. Her voice remained polite. Nobody would have guessed the storm unfolding behind her eyes. Across the building, Rachel Monroe stood near the front desk reviewing schedules. She looked confident as always. Professional, organized, respected by upper management. Yet every time Emily saw her, memories returned. Months earlier, shortly after Matthew's accident, Emily had spent weeks trying to understand why the insurance claim had been denied. Doctors had recommended intensive rehabilitation. Specialists believed Matthew had an excellent chance of recovery. Then the approval process suddenly changed. Forms disappeared. Reviews stalled. Phone calls went unanswered. Eventually, a denial letter arrived. The decision forced Emily to take extra jobs just to keep treatment going. At first, she assumed it was another example of bureaucracy, a mistake buried somewhere inside a complicated system. Then she discovered Rachel Monroe's name. Back then, Rachel worked as an independent claims consultant for a regional insurance contractor. Emily remembered sitting inside a cramped office clutching medical records while Rachel reviewed documents across a polished desk. Emily had pleaded for reconsideration. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just honestly. She explained Matthew's condition, his treatment plan, his chances of recovery. Rachel listened without expression. Then she closed the file and said something Emily would never forget. "I am sure your brother is a good person, but my responsibility is protecting the company from unnecessary costs." Those words had changed everything. The appeal failed. Treatment slowed. Medical debt exploded. And somehow, months later, Rachel appeared at the Grand Crescent Hotel as Emily's new manager. The coincidence felt impossible. Yet, it happened. Emily never mentioned their history. She needed the job too badly. Rachel clearly remembered her. From the first day, the criticism began. Small at first. Extra assignments. Unfair schedules. Public corrections over minor mistakes. Nothing obvious enough to report. Nothing severe enough to prove. Just enough pressure to make every day harder. Emily endured it because she had no choice. Matthew needed therapy. Therapy required money. Money required work. And work meant surviving Rachel Monroe. That evening, Jonathan Hayes sat in a private conference room reviewing another set of documents. Rebecca had continued investigating. Additional records covered the table. Employment history, insurance reports, internal communications. The deeper Jonathan looked, the more troubling the situation became. Rachel Monroe had approved several disputed claim denials during her consulting years. Most followed normal procedures. One case stood apart. Matthew Carter's file contained unusual review notes and recommendations that contradicted independent medical assessments. Jonathan frowned. Something about the timeline felt wrong. Then Rebecca entered carrying another folder. "I found an internal audit report," she said. Jonathan looked up. "And?" The insurance contractor quietly ended its relationship with Rachel Monroe 6 months after the Carter claim. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Rebecca hesitated. "Officially, restructuring. Unofficially, questions about decision-making practices." Silence settled over the room. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Jonathan stared at the documents spread before him. For days he had suspected there was more to Emily's story than anyone realized. Now he was beginning to understand something even more disturbing. Rachel Monroe had not simply crossed paths with Emily Carter twice. Their connection had started long before the hotel. And if his instincts were correct, the woman everyone viewed as a difficult manager might be hiding a truth she never expected anyone to uncover. The following week, tension seemed to settle over the Grand Crescent Hotel like an approaching storm. Nothing obvious had changed. Guests still arrived carrying designer luggage. Business meetings still filled the conference rooms. Crystal chandeliers still illuminated the lobby with warm golden light. Yet beneath the polished surface, something was shifting. Emily Carter felt it. Rachel Monroe felt it. And Jonathan Hayes was quietly becoming the reason why. Jonathan had learned long ago that truth rarely revealed itself all at once. People exposed themselves through patterns, through habits, through small mistakes repeated over time. Instead of confronting Rachel immediately, he continued watching. The more he observed, the more concerned he became. Employee schedules showed a clear pattern. Staff members Rachel disliked consistently received the most difficult assignments. Complaints disappeared from internal reports. Performance reviews often contradicted customer feedback. Individually, each issue seemed minor. Together, they painted a troubling picture. Meanwhile, Emily continued living exactly as she always had. She worked. She visited Matthew. She slept inside her aging sedan. She never complained. Even after exhausting shifts, she still found ways to help others. One evening, Jonathan watched her spend 30 minutes assisting a new employee who had accidentally mixed up several reservations. Emily could have walked away. Instead, she stayed until the problem was solved. The young employee nearly cried from relief. Emily simply smiled and returned to work. Moments like that made Jonathan increasingly uncomfortable with what he was discovering. Because genuinely kind people were rare, and life seemed determined to make Emily's harder. Late Friday afternoon, Jonathan received the call he had been waiting for. Rebecca entered his office carrying another folder. Unlike the others, this one looked thick. "We found the audit records," she said quietly. Jonathan set down his coffee. "Tell me." Rebecca opened the file. The insurance contractor never publicly disclosed the results, but internal reviewers questioned several decisions connected to Rachel Monroe. Jonathan listened carefully. "Including Matthew Carter's claim?" Rebecca nodded. "Especially Matthew Carter's claim." Silence filled the office. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Jonathan studied the pages one by one. Independent medical reviewers had recommended extended coverage. Internal communications showed unusual pressure to reduce costs. Certain evaluations appeared to have been dismissed without adequate justification. None of it proved criminal conduct, but it revealed something else. Judgment influenced by personal priorities rather than fairness. Jonathan closed the folder slowly. His jaw tightened. "Does Emily know any of this?" "Probably not," Rebecca answered. "Most of these records were never made public." That evening, Jonathan drove to St. Matthew Medical Center. He did not enter immediately. Instead, he sat in his car watching the entrance. 20 minutes later, Emily arrived carrying a paper bag. Through the hospital windows, he saw her laughing with Matthew. For a few moments, both siblings seemed completely free from worry. Jonathan found himself staring at the scene longer than expected. Then he noticed something. Matthew handed Emily a folded piece of paper. She opened it. Her eyes widened. Even from a distance, Jonathan could see emotion wash across her face. Later, after Emily left, Jonathan learned what the paper contained. A rehabilitation report. Matthew had made significant progress. For the first time, doctors believed he might regain much more independence than previously expected. It should have been wonderful news. Yet attached to the report was another estimate. Additional treatment costs. Additional months of therapy. Additional expenses Emily could never afford alone. Jonathan stared at the numbers. Then he looked toward the dark highway stretching beyond the hospital. Somewhere along the way, a hard-working young woman had been forced into an impossible choice between survival and hope. And for the first time since this story began, Jonathan Hayes stopped asking whether he should get involved. He began asking how much longer he could remain silent. Monday arrived with clear skies and bright sunlight reflecting from the glass towers downtown. To most people, it felt like the beginning of an ordinary week. Inside the Grand Crescent Hotel, it felt like the calm. Before something important, Emily Carter sensed it the moment she stepped through the employee entrance. Conversations seemed quieter. Managers moved with unusual urgency. Even Rachel Monroe appeared distracted. Throughout the morning, rumors drifted through the staff lounge. A major corporate event was scheduled for that evening. Executives, investors, and media representatives from across the country would attend. Jonathan Hayes himself would be hosting. Emily paid little attention. Wealthy people gathered at the hotel all the time. Her concerns lived elsewhere. They lived inside hospital rooms, payment notices, and therapy schedules. By late afternoon, the ballroom had been transformed. Crystal chandeliers glowed above elegant tables dressed in white linen. Fresh flowers lined the stage. Staff members moved quickly through final preparations. Emily helped arrange place settings while quietly calculating how many additional shifts she might need next month. The answer never seemed to get smaller. Across the room, Jonathan Hayes stood near the stage reviewing final details. Rebecca approached carrying a tablet. "Everything is ready," she said. Jonathan nodded. His gaze drifted toward Emily. She was helping another employee adjust decorations that were not even part of her assignment. She did it without being asked, just as she always did. Rebecca followed his gaze. "She still does not know?" Jonathan shook his head. "No, and Rachel. She knows something is coming." As evening settled over the city, luxury cars began arriving beneath the hotel's illuminated entrance. Guests filled the ballroom. Conversations blended into a soft hum of wealth and influence. Cameras flashed. Glasses sparkled. Yet Jonathan's attention remained fixed on something far more important than any business deal. Shortly before the program began, Rachel approached him with a professional smile. "Everything is prepared for tonight." "I am sure it is," Jonathan replied calmly. Something in his tone caused her smile to falter. Only slightly, but enough. The event began exactly at 7 o'clock. Jonathan stepped onto the stage. Applause filled the room. He thanked investors, partners, and employees. Then he paused. The room gradually grew quiet. "Before we discuss business," he said, "there is another subject I would like to address." Rachel stiffened. Jonathan continued. "Leadership is not measured by profit alone. It is measured by fairness, integrity, accountability." Several executives exchanged confused glances. This was not part of the expected program. Jonathan pressed a button on a remote control. A large screen behind him illuminated. Documents appeared. Audit reports, internal reviews, employment records. The ballroom fell silent. Rachel's face lost color. Jonathan never raised his voice. He did not need to. Facts spoke clearly enough. He outlined findings from the investigation. Questionable decisions. Suppressed recommendations. Patterns of behavior that contradicted company values. No insults. No public humiliation. Only truth. Emily stood frozen near the back of the room. At first, she did not understand what she was seeing. Then Rachel's name appeared on the screen. One document after another. One connection after another. The same history she had spent months carrying alone. Gasps moved through the crowd. Rachel attempted to speak. Jonathan remained calm. "Everyone deserves fairness," he said, "especially people who have already faced enough hardship." For the first time since arriving at the hotel, Emily felt something she had almost forgotten existed. Not relief. Not victory. Something quieter. The feeling that perhaps she was no longer standing alone. For several moments after Jonathan Hayes finished speaking, the ballroom remained completely silent. No one rushed to fill the emptiness. No one knew what to say. Beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, executives, investors, and hotel employees sat frozen as the truth settled over the room. Emily Carter stood near the back of the ballroom with tears gathering in her eyes. Not because someone had finally exposed what happened, but because someone had finally believed her story without asking her to prove her worth first. Jonathan stepped away from the podium. The presentation ended without drama, without anger, without spectacle. Facts had done their work. Over the following days, changes came quietly. Internal reviews were completed. Leadership decisions were made. Policies were updated. The Grand Crescent Hotel moved forward with a renewed commitment to fairness and transparency. Employees noticed the difference almost immediately. The atmosphere became lighter. People smiled more. Conversations returned. For the first time in months, Emily arrived at work without feeling a knot of anxiety in her stomach. Yet the most important changes happened far from the hotel. 1 week after the event, Emily received a phone call while sitting beside Matthew's hospital bed. She expected another billing question, another administrative problem. Instead, a representative informed her that Matthew's case had been reevaluated. Additional treatment support had been approved through a combination of corrective measures and charitable medical funding. Emily sat motionless as the woman explained the details. The remaining balance would no longer prevent Matthew from continuing rehabilitation. For several seconds, Emily could not speak. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks. Across from her, Matthew immediately knew something had happened. "What is it?" he asked. Emily laughed through the tears. "You are staying in therapy." Matthew stared. Then a smile slowly spread across his face. Neither sibling spoke again for a while. They simply sat together beneath the afternoon sunlight pouring through the hospital windows. Sometimes hope arrived so quietly that it sounded almost like silence. Months passed. Summer gave way to autumn. Leaves turned gold across the city parks. The skyline shimmered beneath clear blue skies. Life gradually began to heal. Matthew's progress exceeded expectations. He grew stronger every week. Small victories became larger ones. Distances that once seemed impossible became manageable. Confidence returned alongside independence. Emily continued working at the Grand Crescent, but her circumstances changed as well. The hotel offered her a new position, helping train incoming staff. Nobody received special treatment. Nobody handed her success. She earned every opportunity through the same kindness and dedication that had always defined her. Character. One crisp October afternoon, Emily walked through Riverside Park beside Matthew. The air smelled of fallen leaves and fresh coffee from nearby vendors. Children laughed near a fountain. Dogs chased tennis balls across open grass. It felt like an ordinary day, the best kind of day. Ahead, a familiar figure sat on a bench overlooking the river. Jonathan Hayes. Matthew recognized him immediately. That is the billionaire. Emily smiled. Yes, it is. Jonathan stood as they approached. His expression carried the same quiet calm she remembered from the ballroom. You both look well, he said. We are getting there, Emily replied. Jonathan glanced toward Matthew, who stood taller and stronger than before. Looks like someone has been working hard. Matthew grinned. She never lets me quit. Jonathan laughed softly. For a moment, the three of them stood watching sunlight dance across the water. No headlines. No speeches. No grand celebrations. Just people whose lives had briefly intersected in a way none of them expected. Eventually, Jonathan nodded and prepared to leave. Before he did, Emily spoke. Thank you. Jonathan looked at her. For what? Emily glanced toward the river. For seeing what everyone else missed. Jonathan smiled gently. I did not see anything special, Emily. I simply paid attention. As he walked away, Emily watched the autumn breeze scatter golden leaves across the path, and she realized something important. Cruelty often arrives loudly. It demands attention. It leaves scars. But dignity moves differently. Quietly. Patiently. One choice at a time. And in the end, dignity has a way of outlasting everything else.